Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll let people trickle in, but get started because we have a very full program to get through today. I'm Joel Dodge. I'm chair of the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter, and we are thrilled to present today's panel on a new era of American industrial policy, along with our fellow chapters in Washington State, the Bay Area, Columbus, Austin, and Washington, D.C. Thank you for co-sponsoring today's event with us. So just 2 days ago, President Biden signed into law a bill that, among other things, invests $370 billion to fight climate change and empowers the government to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. That comes just weeks after he signed a law investing billions to build up US-based semiconductor manufacturing and to spark new research and development in science and technology. So just candidly, when we started planning today's event a couple months ago, the CHIPS and Science Act was kind of stuck in conference committee purgatory, and the Inflation Reduction Act was still several Joe Manchin twists and turns away from even being conceived. We're going to be discussing both of these landmark pieces of legislation today and how they fit into a broader resurgence of modern American industrial policy. We'll also look ahead to executive actions President Biden can take to turbocharge the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'll also talk about policy guardrails that can be put in place to maximize the effectiveness and equity of industrial policy in the United States. So we are very, very fortunate to have a great panel of experts to talk through these issues and share their ideas with us, including ideas that are literally brand new today, drawing on some hot off the presses, just released reports that our panelists have put out. So Arnab Datta is senior counsel at the think tank Employ America, and a former aide to Senator Michael Bennet. Todd Tucker is the director of industrial policy and trade at the Roosevelt Institute, and he also lectures on political economy at Johns Hopkins. And Lenore Palladino is an economist, lawyer, and assistant professor of economics and public policy at UMass Amherst, and she works with policymakers, organizers, and advocates, economists, legal experts, and students to craft policies that rebalance power in our economy. So thank you each for being here. And for those tuning in, we're going to save time for your questions toward the end of the hour. So please submit them using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any time. And with that, let's get started. So I wanted to just start with the basics. What is industrial policy? What do we mean when we talk about it? And why is it having a moment right now today? Todd, I'll let you kick things off.
Yes, well, thanks so much to Joel and Faith and all the ACS community for having us out today. As Joel mentions, this was in fact exceptionally good timing, less than 48 hours after the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act that caps off just like a series of important industrial policy legislations and announcements. So I think the timing could not be better. I would very much agree on that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, there's a lot of different definitions of what constitutes industrial policy out there. Sometimes it's been used to sort of deal like only with technological innovation questions or with sort of heavy manufacturing, jobs that require hard hats, things like that. We take in these reports and others that we've written for the Roosevelt Institute, we take a little bit of a broader definition. So that you can kind of see as citizens and as voters the wide extent of industrial policy that we in fact practice just without calling it that. So at a very basic level, we would define industrial policy as any policy that influences the distribution of resources, whether that's capital or labor, between industries, and specifically any policy that's not neutral about how that distribution occurs. So when you look at it that way, certainly it encompasses technology policy, a lot of technology policy, a lot of heavy manufacturing policy, but it also includes policies towards the real estate industry or towards the service sector. When the government is sort of deciding and making decisions about the outcomes that it wants to see in terms of the industrial composition of our economy, it's doing industrial policy. And when you group all the disparate industrial policies that exist into a sort of plan for the economy and a vision and a blueprint for where we want to see, what we want to see 10 years from now, 20 years from now, in terms of the kinds of sectors and jobs that will be thriving in the economy, then that's, you could call that industrial planning. And that's something that, it's not just China that does that. It is a lot of our trading partners in Europe have done versions of this over the years. And it's something that we do explicitly for defense spending in the military industrial complex. I think what's new about a lot of these policies that we're seeing in the last year and a half from the Biden administration is that we're now bringing some of those concepts that folks at the Pentagon have long been employing and bringing it into the civilian sector of the economy. And I think we'll get a chance to talk about this later on in our conversation. But major pieces of legislation that have been reauthorized many times, like the Defense Production Act, for instance, despite its name, is not really only about military and national, traditional national defense concerns, but it has a lot of authority for things like promoting the health of the civilian economy as well. And so basically what we're seeing a lot in this last year is that the Biden administration is just catching up with what Congress has long authorized the executive branch to do, but not until now have really decided to begin venturing towards the full suite of policies that are already on the books and others that could be on the books with enough support.
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking more about the Defense Production Act later in the program. Arnab, I'll turn to you. What do you make of this industrial policy moment? I mean, it wasn't too long ago that industrial policy was sort of a dirty word in American politics. So what's the kind of historical pedigree that got us to today?
Yeah, I think we're kind of coming out of a moment, let's call it starting sometime around the late 70s to the 80s, a moment that really emphasized market fundamentalism. The idea that most of these problems in economic management would be best solved by private industry acting in accordance with private markets, with little touch from the federal government. As Todd said, I think one piece of that, though, is we never really got rid of a lot of these industrial policy tools. They were just kind of disparate. They weren't done in a planning, in a forward-looking sense. And I think over the past couple of years, especially in wake of COVID, we've realized that we can't just leave our economy and economic management to the cycle of just a neoliberal economy, essentially, that runs in that manner. And so I think there's a lot, and I think this is one reason you're seeing a bit more of a bipartisan consensus towards it as well, that we can't just focus on the tools of the market, the private market, to achieve our economic ends. Part of that is that our competitors, especially China, are using these tools in their own ways to achieve technological advantages and commercial advantages in pretty critical sectors. So I think that competitive spirit is animating part of it. And then also we have this huge challenge of decarbonization. And that is a challenge that will require considerable coordination between the federal government and private industry. The only way we can really hit our targets is through better coordination. And what you're seeing is, as Todd alluded to, a lot of these tools have existed for quite a long time. It's just they're kind of being dusted off the shelf. And so in order to really kind of utilize them and build new institutions that are maybe more appropriate for our time, I think there's a lot of energy going towards that. But because we're kind of coming out of this long period of market fundamentalism, we're getting some growing pains as we try to think about these different tools.
And Lenore, what conditions do you think kind of set the stage for ending this period of market fundamentalism, as Arnab put it? Is this resurgence in industrial policy, is it a coincidence that it's coming on the heels of a global pandemic and the supply chain shocks that came out of it and the ensuing economic inflation?
Yeah, no, of course not. I mean, I think, I'll agree, first of all, with what Todd and Arnab said. I think more broadly, we are in a moment where we've got, I'm old enough to remember the financial crisis. And now we've had COVID. We have obviously climate change as a constant crisis looming over us. We have social movements that have been pushing for recognition of structural inequalities in our society. We have social movements pushing for government to be more active. We have policymakers and economists in the US government today who actually understand the harms of neoliberalism. So I think that all these factors are coming together. I'll make sort of one, flesh out maybe one point a little bit more precisely. You know, I think when we talk about neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, we're talking about a broader sort of misunderstanding of how the economy works and how the government and the economy, the government and private markets fit together. A lot of my work has focused specifically on the idea that US corporations operate under this framework of what we often call shareholder primacy. And this will be familiar to the lawyers who have, you know, we took corporations, we took securities law courses, et cetera. We have this idea embedded in a sort of, you know, in some controversial ways, but embedded pretty deeply in our practices, that shareholders are the main actors within corporations that deserve the benefits from innovation, based on this idea that's, in my view, false, that they are the residual risk takers, that they contribute the most value to corporations, whereas I think in many ways today in publicly traded corporations, they're contributing the least. And so we've had all these pressures over the last 40 years grow, coming from the rise of institutional investors, coming from sort of growing wealth concentration in our society, that has really led to a focus within many of our businesses on payments to shareholders being the priority of their activity, which has led to a decline in real investment and a decline in a focus on improving innovation and productivity in the private, you know, leading private corporations themselves. So I think this is another specific piece that has really played into, you know, what has, I think, been recognized by policymakers, which is that, you know, we're not going to solve our major structural problems in our economy and in our society by simply relying on private markets. It's just not working. And so that's where I think this renewed interest really in industrial policy is coming from, and why it's so important to be really clear about how industrial policy has to be structured to solve problems.
Great. So let's turn to the new legislation at the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. There are tons of provisions in these two bills, but I wanted to hear from each of you about the highlights. Like, what to you are the most significant or most interesting pieces of these packages that we can kind of collectively call Bidenomics? You know, what speaks to you in the industrial policy space here? Todd, I'll let you kick it off again.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important contributions of the Inflation Reduction Act is to really reconceptualize how we use tax credits in the U.S. Economy. This is something, you know, a lot of our trade competitors tend to use much more direct mechanisms to promote specific desired outcomes, you know, to specific firms in specific places doing specific things, right? And because of the filibuster and reconciliation rules, among other reasons, but I think that's certainly one major reason that we end up relying on things that have sort of that very clear budgetary and sort of tax impact. And so tax credits are easy to pass the test. You know, and social scientists have been critical of tax credits, and advocates have been critical of tax credits in the past for a number of reasons. You know, one is that you're basically kind of leaving it up to private sector actors to step up to the plate and kind of do things more or less without a whole lot of conditions attached to them. And, you know, rather than sort of having that more directed industrial policy approach. It's also, you know, there are times where, you know, for folks that are working class or in poverty, sometimes don't make enough, you know, to even sort of have, you know, the tax liability that you know could have them benefit from the tax credits. So, you know, it's part of the tax credits are part of what we call the submerged state, which is basically, you know, is both like a cause and consequence of what we're talking about here. I mean, I think one of the things that's problematic about the submerged state is that people may not attribute the policy changes that come from tax credits to the government policy, right? They may think it's actually like the firm that took advantage of the production tax credit that was making the decision. And so people don't see the government role. And as a consequence, government may not get as much credit as it should for the policy in the first place. I think that, so because of reconciliation, because of the filibuster, there was this nevertheless heavy reliance on tax credits. But the tax credits in the IRA look just very different than tax credits have in the past, certainly than they did in Obama's 2009 stimulus package, which is that they are starting to look a lot more like other tools that the government uses, like procurement and grants, that often have a lot more conditions attached to them. So to benefit from some of the production and investment tax credits, companies need to be paying prevailing wages, having strong apprenticeship programs to diversify the kinds of people that get brought into the building trades and other sectors. In some cases, it requires that the supply chains be made in America, be bought, by American for the product that's getting made. And in some cases, it's an outright condition of getting the tax credits. In a lot of other cases, for different sectors, the companies that are claiming the tax credit will get a bump up of 5 times the amount, the value of the tax credit, if they follow those labor and production conditions. And so what that really does, to just sort of reference another social science idea of embedded liberalism that we study in sort of international affairs, and people that are familiar with Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian, the European social scientist, may have an idea of this. Basically, tools like this are an effort by the state to yoke the interest of business and capital more strongly to the communities and workers that produce the goods. So literally, they will do better on their bottom line if they do better by their workforce. So I think that that's where sort of that Build Back Better agenda ended was different than where it started in terms of the types of conditions and mechanisms that were used. But this is what survived the parliamentarian scrub. And I would say it is tax credits, so that's kind of the drawback. But the benefit of it is that these are very different kind of tax credits than we've seen in the past.
Thanks, Todd. Arnab, how about you? What are your highlights from the Bidenomics bills?
Yeah, I would just kind of second what Todd said there too. I think the kind of innovation in the using the tax credits here is pretty interesting. Quite similar to the child tax credit and framing that as advanced payments as we had in the American Rescue Plan. I think there's a couple of things else I would point to. One on both in the Inflation Reduction Act and then one in the CHIPS Act. In the CHIPS Act, there's this funding for wireless innovation. It's about 1.5 billion that was put into that. It was authorized, I think, back in 2018 or 19, but that's something that could actually have pretty important disinflationary impact if they use it wisely. That money could be deployed to help air carriers update their technology, their altimeters, so that you can get more widespread adoption of 5G. One thing we saw in the 2010s was when universal data planes became a thing. You saw kind of both a competition on price, so the prices went considerably down, and you saw quality adjustments, which were reflected in the inflation data. So that's just like one small area that's quite powerful in terms of its inflation impact, even though it was in the other bill. And then from the Inflation Reduction Act perspective, I think two things that I would really point to. One is finally, we've got the ability to negotiate prices for pharmaceutical. I would frame this well within the context of industrial policy, in that the federal government is using its purchasing power to improve standard of living and outcomes for Americans. I think that's like something that's really powerful. It is the use of federal government purchasing power, either through procurement, through what we see with Medicare purchasing drugs, or with things like advanced market commitments, can be a really powerful tool of industrial policy. And this is just showing one way that you can kind of use it to improve policy outcomes. The other big thing that I think is quite powerful is the huge, not appropriation, but about a $5 billion appropriation that went to the Loan Programs Office at the Department of Energy, that will be used to backstop up to $250 billion in loan guarantees. this is just like an incredibly clever way to draft legislation where you can only get 5 billion as an appropriation as a hit against your CBO score, but you're really stretching it to what could be 250 billion of support. That is a really, really innovative thing. It dramatically increases the amount of loan guarantees that the loan programs office can get. And it's a new authority. I'm doing some work right now on unpacking kind of all of the different things that could be used for. But the person who runs that office, Jigar Shah, just put a tweet out the other day about a plant in California that they're trying to bring back online, and how that new program can be used for that. And I think that's like just goes to show you how much scope there is to be doing good stuff, and it only cost us $5 billion. So that's those are the things that I'm really tracking and enjoying.
Yeah, and if I'm understanding correctly, I don't think any of that 250 billion potential is being included in the projections about the kind of emissions.
Yeah, that's correct. So that's not at all part of the $370 billion number that's been that was in there for energy stuff. So it's really bringing it to over 600 billion when you count that impact.
Yeah, and the loan programs office is I believe it's the office that at one point bailed out or at least supported Tesla when it was in financial straits.
That is correct. Yeah.
After the 2009 stimulus. Thank you. Lenore, how about you? What are your highlights from the IRA and from CHIPS?
Yeah, well, first, I'm realizing that we're all avidly following Jigar Shah's Twitter stream, which I was not until probably a couple months ago. But it's a fun way to engage in industrial policy in real time. So I'll just add maybe another point. Sort of stepping back for a second, I think that the CHIPS and Science Act, it focused on a particular industry. It's a whole bill focused on a particular critical sector. The government went out and said, and very much in collaboration with the private sector leaders who were pursuing this bill. They were an active partner in making it happen. Let's be clear on that. But I think that that's a sort of good example of where we can and should see the policymakers focusing on the critical sectors of the economy that need and will benefit from market crafting, or will benefit from public shaping of how the sectors actually work. And so one specific example that I'll talk about is the companies that were the leaders of sort of the lobbying group that had been pushing for the CHIPS Act to pass. So Intel, IBM, Qualcomm, Texas Instruments, and Broadcom. These are some of those, financialized or companies that had prioritized shareholder payments to the extreme over the last 10 years. So, for example, they spent 71% of their net income on stock buybacks, which are a corporate financial practice that maybe I can talk about later. But 71% of profits on one kind of shareholder payment over the decade of the 2010s. Intel itself spent 100% of its profits on shareholder payments in the early part of the 2010s. The dollar amount of that was for the companies altogether, 250 billion, which is about 5 times the magnitude of what the CHIPS Act subsidies ended up looking like. And so I think one thing that really I found very important about the progress that we're making in industrial policy is, we didn't see the bright line sort of limits written into the actual legislation on shareholder payments or excessive shareholder payments like we saw in the CARES Act, which, did have actually limits back in 2020 on the kinds of shareholder payments that companies could make when they were receiving that, emergency infusion in the beginning of the pandemic. We're in a different moment now. The, CHIPS has different goals. We didn't see it in the statute, but we do see now the Department of Commerce publicly and explicitly in its sort of statement of essentially how it's going to approach its giving preference to different companies who now have to apply for funding through the CHIPS Act, they say specifically that this funding is not meant to create windfalls for the companies that receive them. And they say they will give preference to companies that commit to make future investments, that grow the domestic semiconductor industry, and not engage in stock buybacks. So we've gotten a lot of media attention to the guardrails they've put out about investment in China, right? That's part of the story here. But I think that they're also putting out, and hopefully we'll see even more explicit development of preferences around the idea that this public funding is not meant to subsidize the kind of shareholder primacy activity that we've seen from these companies over the last decade. And to me, that explicit attention publicly and recognition of how this funding should be allocated is really exciting.
Thank you. So looking forward past these particular pieces of legislation, it's probably fair to say that this Congress has likely exhausted what it can do legislatively around industrial policy. But Todd and Arnab, you've written a new paper that looks at industrial policy options through executive action, the things that Biden can do without Congress. Can you just give us some of the highlights from that? I'll leave it to you two, who wants to lead.
I can. I'll start, and then Arnab, please chime in. Yeah, we looked at. We actually had more than 7 at one point. I think we had like closer to 15. There was a lot of different ideas, but these were the ones that we were ready to hit go on. 2 days after the Inflation Reduction Act was signed. But I think that there's if you look broadly at the estimates from Rhodium Group and other consultancies about what the projected impact of the IRA is going to mean for the US's climate obligations, it's the number that I'm seeing is that it gets us about 70% of the way towards meeting the US's Paris commitments under the Paris Climate Accords. And so then I think it's a very legit question is like, how do we get the rest of the 30% there? And want to make very clear, this is we are not saying that like we have modeled something and that this will fill the 30% gap, but rather what we're saying is that these are the types of tools that the executive branch could be using to make additional contributions above and beyond what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'll mention just 2 things: one that could help reduce global emissions, and one that could reduce domestic emissions. On the global emissions side, under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the executive branch has wide-ranging authority to restrict imports and enter into international agreements when imports are threatening the, quote, national security. And national security is defined very broadly here to include not just, again, sort of traditional military or defense considerations, but also sort of the economic health and well-being of domestic industries, with the idea being that if you don't have healthy industries and healthy workforces for civilian production, then you're also not going to have it for defense production, so that the two are kind of are deeply connected. Trump actually showed what we could be doing here when he restricted steel and aluminum imports, putting 25% and 10% tariffs on them in the name of national security. Now, we can debate the merits of that individual determination. I mean, it was backed by agency staff of the Department of Commerce, who I think were rightly noting that for a few decades now, we've had a serious problem at the global level with steel overcapacity due to Chinese subsidies. That not enough policymakers from either party had really been doing anything to address. But the thing about sort of that expansive definition of national security in the Trade Expansion Act is that it could be used to identify carbon-intensive imports as a threat to the national security, which is I would say at least as, and if not much more compelling than the Trump use of what's called Section 232, in that we have this extensive record of almost every agency of government identifying climate change as one of the major threats to economic resilience. So basically what the administration could do is transition the Trump national security steel tariffs over to a series of steel tariffs or steel agreements to lower the carbon intensity of production abroad. So this is a very important and fairly unrestricted tool. We're already seeing the administration begin to go down this road with the announcement with the European Union of a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, which could be the basis for the type of action that we describe in the paper. That's still under negotiation, so we'll see where it goes. But that could be a very important sort of stick and carrot that the administration could use to bring other countries along towards cleaner forms of industrial production. That's sort of on global emissions. On domestic emissions, one of the things that the administration has at its disposal that it's already, launched executive orders around is using the Defense Production Act to promote further decarbonization of the domestic economy. One way that they could do that is by using Title III, Section 303 of the Defense Production Act to make commitments towards advanced market purchases for green products. And so that could take the form of, say, 5 years from now, the federal government will be willing to be the buyer of last resort for, say, $10 billion worth of green steel production, made using, zero carbon emissions. In the first instance, what the firms could do is try to sell that to the auto companies, to state and local governments, to other purchasers of steel. And it's only if they're unsuccessful doing that the federal government would be on the hook to be that buyer of last resort. And so we suggest some ways to use the Defense Production Act and also to sort of tinker with the way that the executive branch uses accounting rules to make it clear that you only need appropriations up to the extent that you're actually expecting to lose money, right? And we have other ideas along those lines there. But so with those two examples, I'll stop. And Arnab and his team at Employ America, Ashley George, and also our fourth co-author, Joel Michaels of Yale Law School, have done a really, really important contributions towards rounding out that list of recommendations.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, so I think one thing we talk about in the report is just the importance of the government as a purchaser of last resort, and that part of the toolkit. So there's a couple of ways that the executive branch could utilize its authorities. The first that we really talked about, that Ashley and I talked about, was using other transactions authority. So this sounds kind of goofy, but it literally is just authority to do transactions other than whatever is authorized. It's quite a flexible tool. I think interestingly, it has its roots, its origins in the space race, and when they were writing the bill to create NASA, they included this authority, knowing that you kind of need flexible tools to deploy funding to meet any contingency. And I think given that the decarbonization challenge is similar, that you're going to kind of have to play a little bit of whack-a-mole with problems that come up, the OTA authority is one that can be utilized quite well. And I think I would add to Todd's points that you could potentially use this to boost your emissions commitments closer to the Paris goals. But I think even beyond that, in order to even get to the 70% reduction, I think we need to have the toolkit to address potential price increases or supply chain vulnerabilities and different things like that might sprout up as we try to get to that goal. And so some of these authorities could also be used to help you get to make the Inflation Reduction Act really, really actually meet kind of be paid for properly and actually have the impact that it's projected to have. So OTA is something where you can basically engage in flexible contracts of any kind. This can be used to do advanced market commitments, as Todd has already talked about. And then you can kind of create ways to incentivize private participation in unique transactions that you can't with the existing kind of procurement rules that are outlined in the federal acquisition regulations. Those tend to be pretty onerous. They also reward corporations, companies that have the budgets to actually comply with them. So this is something that you can do in a much more targeted manner. That's a big benefit of it. You can structure these agreements in ways that both incentivize private participation, but end up costing the government very little. That could be through things like equity stakes or other forms of participation where they're getting a royalty payment back. There's a lot of different creative ways that it's been used in the past. And this is a very, very utilized tool at the Defense Department and DARPA. The former general counsel of DARPA, Richard Dunn, really pioneered its use in that space as well. And then I think the other two that I would point to, one is there's this thing at the Treasury Department called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. It's been used to, in the past, address global financial crises. 2008, at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. This is something where if there is a linkage to exchange rate stability, you have quite a bit of flexibility in what type of tools, what type of contracts, what type of structures you could use. The Treasury Secretary actually has quite a bit of authority there. So at Employ America, we've actually written about how that could be used to stabilize oil prices and commodity prices more broadly. Decarbonization is going to put an enormous amount of stress on commodity prices. And so that's something where, as a short-term facility, you could consider using it to the extent that it would have a stabilizing impact on currency and exchange rates globally. And then the final thing we looked at was exploring partnerships with government corporations as purchasing agents for the energy transition. I think one of the most interesting ones we thought about here was the Tennessee Valley Authority. It has, like most government corporations, they have just a wider set of tools to design contracts and structures. They can use options to really help the seller keep the upside potential that they might get from selling something, but provide a floor on their risk so that they can hedge their production for whatever it is that the TVA would be purchasing from them. So I think that's something where, to the extent that you can set a soft price floor for some of these critical goods through the TVA, and then still maintain the upside for private industry, that's something that could really encourage a lot of investment. So those are the three that we've really been looking at and excited to explore more.
Yeah, those are great, exciting ideas. If you want to read more from Arnab and Todd's paper, we put the link in the chat, so you can go look at all 7 proposals for executive action around industrial policy. Lenore, you've also written about some of the guardrails we should think about including to basically ensure that private companies who are beneficiaries of industrial policy aren't kind of exploiting public funds to benefit their shareholders. And that paper is, again, just out today. We'll put the link in the chat as well. But can you just give us some of the highlights on that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And this was fun to get these papers out together. I think they're a nice complement. And Isabella Estevez and I wrote this together. Since she's not on the webinar, just make sure to mention her work on this as well. So I mean, I've mentioned a bunch of this thus far, and I think that there's been actually, in a way that is almost surprising and great, some good examples where these guardrails have already been put in place in a beginning sense in the CHIPS Act, and hopefully as it rolls out in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'll talk about 3 kinds of different guardrails that we talk about in the paper. One is what I've been really talking about thus far, which is to limit extractive behavior. So to limit the ability of corporations to, or corporate leadership to, on the one hand, be claiming public investment as a benefit for their productivity, but then on the other hand, turning around and spending tons of the company's funds on activities like stock buybacks or increasing executive compensation, which we know has been a real problem for the last couple decades. So I think there's room for guardrails both within enabling legislation, within statutes themselves, like we saw in the CARES Act, but there's also a lot of room for the agencies that are actually conducting these industrial policies to put preferences out themselves, that they will really give more attention to companies that have made explicit commitments to really produce, to be innovative. And so I mentioned the Department of Commerce. I'll be, watching closely to see how the Department of Energy shapes its program going forward. And then 2 other types of guardrails that I'll just mention briefly. If we come back to sort of again, like first principles of what we might have learned in law school about corporations, really, in my view, is false. Corporations are not these sort of empty shells where you have shareholders creating, negotiating some kind of contracts with managers where shareholders are the principal and managers are the agents. That's actually not how corporations actually produce and are effective. We need to, I think, from an economics, understand them as economic entities that require, multiple groups of stakeholders to engage in the production process, funding and financing, yes, sometimes from shareholders, sometimes from debt, sometimes from retained earnings, management leading the organizational and strategic capacity of the particular, production process. And then there's the workforce, right? And so part of industrial policy in a wider administration that has committed to workers' rights and has committed to the value of people having good jobs in America. Industrial policy should also understand that there's ways to encourage companies through industrial policy to have a stronger voice for workers in the innovative process. So there's the sort of traditional things we know about in terms of prevailing wages and not blocking workers' rights to unionize. We also write in the paper about ideas of sort of enabling collective worker voice in the production process itself. So I'll happy to talk about that in the Q&A, or people can read more about that in the paper. And then finally, we talk about the idea of how does the public actually benefit from the investments that they make? Should we have public equity stakes in companies where, if you're making an investment for the long term, the government should have a role, maybe through what's sometimes referred to as a golden share, which is a perpetual equity stake that doesn't have the same kind of governance rights as other equity stakes, but has economic rights? Should the government have a more traditional sort of public equity or equity stake where they are involved in some ways in governance for the duration of the investment in the company, like any other shareholder investor is supposed to have? So I think that thinking more broadly, about that as a kind of guardrail, where what we're trying to guard against is public investment flowing in, but it being extracted out by a very small group of wealthy and majority white households who are the private shareholders predominantly in our economy. How do we actually guard against that kind of perpetuation of extraction through things like public equity stakes, where the benefits of this public investment will end up being more broadly shared? So these are all ideas that I think need a lot more development and thinking, but should be part of, I think, a productive industrial policy conversation.
Thanks so much, Lenore. So given that this is ACS, the Supreme Court looms large over everything we think about and do. And so, Todd, let me ask you, all these ideas sound great in theory, but when I hear about creative interpretations of old statutes with broad definitions, I just get a little bit nervous, given that we have a Supreme Court that is intent on rolling back the administrative state and doesn't seem all that friendly to aggressive or creative uses of pre-existing authority for the executive. How should we think about that risk? What's the prognosis for Biden's industrial policy in the courts?
So I'll give you the optimistic take and I'll give you the cynical take, I think both of which have some value, and I could probably argue either one. The optimistic take, and I put that kind of in quotes because it's the result of some fairly scary legal decisions. We know that this Supreme Court is very intent on using things like the major questions doctrine, the non-delegation doctrine, to peel back agency discretion and agency authority, whether that's the Environmental Policy Agency, the EPA, or other agencies. There is some real skepticism, on the part of the right-wing justices and legal movement on the part of expert agencies. That sort of sits somewhat uncomfortably with a real love for the aggrandizement of presidential power and presidentialism. In very recent cases, the Supreme Court has either upheld or declined to review lower courts upholding Trump's use of shifting appropriated money around to build a border wall, of launching the trade war with China, and of using the Defense Production Act to prosecute price gougers and others, right? So this is very recent, Supreme Court or appellate court decisions within just the last year or two. And so I think the real question, it's a political question as much as a legal one, like, would the Supreme Court that just backed Trump's use of presidentialist authorities back Biden's use of presidentialist authorities in order to make it more likely that a President DeSantis down the line could do the Republican version of, a border wall on both sides of the border, and on the oceans as well, right? In order to safeguard that policy space, is there a way that that the justices are skeptical of agencies, but in favor of unilateral presidentialism? And I think that, we make a case in the report, and I encourage all the ACS members to basically take up where we started and write the full legal brief version of some of these arguments, because it's more suggestive rather than definitive on our part. But we do think that there is a path forward for the Biden administration to use these authorities fairly aggressively, and and basically dare the Supreme Court to overrule them. Because if they do some of the things that we've been outlining, it is just super consistent with things that the Trump administration did, but for good reasons, not for bad reasons. The other thing I would just say, the contrary argument that I would point you towards, Ganesh Sitaraman from Vanderbilt and Tim Meyer from Duke have recently put on SSRN an argument that basically they see the major questions doctrine as swallowing this sort of presidentialist exceptionalism, and that basically that the Supreme Court will be raw political, even though it would be better for the right wing to have sort of some of the precedents, even under Biden, to be able to use that maybe just they will, on pure policy preference grounds, say yes to Trump and DeSantis and no to Biden. So, I think that there's arguments you can make either way, but there is at least, I think, there's a plausible sort of legal politics angle to the recommendations that we make.
All right, well, that's reassuring, and it sounds like there may be more work to be done for ACS members on that front. We'll turn to additional questions in a moment, but Arnab or Lenore, did you have anything to add on the SCOTUS issue here?
I would just first of all, I'm a Canadian, and I'm just very offended by the idea that Todd just proposed of a border wall with my native country. But that aside, I think with respect to OTA with some of the spending authorities, as a lot of your members will know, the spending authority, at least the spending power, is one where the federal government still has pretty strong authority. And to the extent that with OTA, I think particularly because a lot of this is going to private industry, these are arrangements that are beneficial for private industry in a lot of ways. I think that some of the more activist elements that might challenge it in courts would be a bit more subdued about this. You'd see, if there was all of a sudden a big challenge to OTA, for example, in the courts, I think you'd see a lot of the defense industrial complex mobilize against that because they like it. They like the flexibility that comes with this. And so I think there's some interesting political, legal questions there that might help some of these things be a bit safer than, let's say, regulation on the environment.
Thanks. Lenore, anything to add?
We could go on about the Supreme Court for hours.
Yes. It could be a whole other program.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got 11 minutes left for Q&A. Again, if anyone in the audience has questions, the Q&A button is a little hidden on Zoom, but if you click the ... on the bottom of your screen, it says more, and go to Q&A, you can submit questions there. But I wanted to ask about what Congress might be turning to next, which is permitting reform, which was sort of a concession or insistence by Senator Manchin that happened as a sidecar piece of legislation following the Inflation Reduction Act. And the idea is that permitting reform would help streamline the process for approving new energy projects. And I know there's a bit of a split among environmentalists, some are worried that this will be a giveaway to fossil fuels. Others see permitting reform as really essential to streamlining the process for clean energy projects to get built to maximize the impact of the IRA. From an industrial policy standpoint, how are you all thinking about permitting reform? Todd, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, well, I should say, I mean, we're still kind of learning more about what that supposed deal is between Manchin and Schumer on permitting reform. You know, the early news reports suggest that the Congressional Progressive Caucus in the House, which by far holds the margin there on the vote count, if no Republicans are supportive of it, you know, they are suggesting that they feel in no way bound by that commitment. So I think it'll be interesting to sort of see what goes on in the months ahead. You know, I think that there's a few different things that we could say about this. I mean, I think one is that, so there's a lot of unknowns about what's in the context of the permitting reform. I think there's also just, you know, the environmental justice movement and environmentalists have shown time and time again, they're actually quite adept at stopping things from happening. And so, you know, whether that's the Keystone Pipeline or other projects, I think that that's something, you know, like we sort of started this conversation of like, here's the US using a new policy muscle that Americans aren't really used to using. I think when you talk about sort of pipeline fights and permitting fights, that's actually something that's well known in every neighborhood and zoning board across America. So I think that it's like, basically my take on that is that this story is far from over, and for people that want to fight it, there's going to be a lot of ways to do so. But I think the other point that you make is important, which is that, you know, if we're going to electrify everything, as a lot of environmentalists say we need to be doing, you're talking about, you know, I've seen estimates of needing as much as 5 times the amount of electric transmission, you know, capacity as we have now. That also is going to go through a permitting process of some kind. So, you know, I think that the sort of the 1970s style environmentalism that was very focused on process questions and the NEPA and things like that are, you know, could plausibly come into conflict or in tension with the need to decarbonize rapidly. So I think that it's like, this is going to be the terrain of politics for potentially the rest of our lives, but at least for the next decade or two. So I think I would say just kind of watch this space to see what happens. But then I think it's also like there are going to be some important philosophical questions as to sort of the value of process versus the value of outcomes that I think kind of need to be centered. You know, in our paper that we released today, we talk about ways to use the Defense Production Act, Title III to get around state and local restrictions. This has been used a lot, you know, or at least a number of times that we've identified in the past, where basically DPA is kind of a trump card against any sort of contrary state and local law. I think that's something that Lenore and I are interested in writing about and researching more, and would encourage all of your members to also do some clever thinking about that. The you know, the number of legal precedents is pretty sparse. But, you know, from what we've been able to ascertain, this would be a way to get around, for instance, Delaware corporate law, you know, which could have some benefits to decarbonization projects. So I think that, you know, it's a very fertile and somewhat volatile political landscape on this question, but I do think that, you know, the story is far from over here.
Lenore, I'll let you weigh in on that question too, but I also want to ask more broadly about how you think about some of these competing goals within industrial policy, right? So like, for example, the Buy American provisions. I know in the electric vehicle space, there's now some concern that the like mineral and component requirements are actually going to sort of undermine the effectiveness of those tax credits, right? So the Buy American provisions might come at the expense of getting more EVs on the road and in garages. I think we've seen a similar dynamic in the solar panel market, where there's been concerns about tariffs on Chinese-produced solar panels. So how do we balance those kinds of competing considerations?
I mean, if I had a clear and crisp answer for that, I would run for president. I think that that's a set of tough questions. And we've seen, for example, I'm in Massachusetts, you know, ongoing debate around wind, and how do you actually balance the need for very rapid investment in siting of wind power offshore in a place where we really should have tons of that, and we just want a victory at the state level, with community concern. And so I think that these types of tensions around sort of Buy American and about how the production process is really going to how do we incentivize private companies to move as quickly as possible without sort of giving away the store. We're going to need, constant community and sort of social movement engagement in these fights. And I know there's law students here who are wondering, how do I engage in this type of work? I think being, whether or not it's your sort of day job, being involved in the kinds of local debates that are happening about energy projects in your local community is a really great way to sort of understand the different dynamics that are happening here. I also think that the more that we can create sort of a virtuous cycle, the more that we see this type of industrial policy and the need to decarbonize rapidly benefiting the society more broadly, and not just sort of directly materially benefiting a small sort of financial elite, the more there will be broad-based support for these types of policies, and then we'll see more policymakers read the room and continue to support increasing industrial policy. I take the position that we don't have a choice in terms of the rapid decarbonization that we need because science. So we have to just do, we're going to have to move very quickly, which gets at some of the process points Todd was making. But I also think the more that the gains are widely shared, which is part of why I'm so interested in the guardrails question, the more there will be social support for these types of projects and the better chance we have of averting some of the worst outcomes of the climate catastrophe.
So we're almost at time, and Arnab, I'll give you the last word here. In addition to any of the questions that Lenore and Todd just weighed in on, we do have a question in the chat, which is a good one to end on, asking what law students who are interested in industrial policy can do to get more involved. And I know Todd's given us some homework around the Defense Production Act and defending the Biden executive actions at the Supreme Court. Might be some fertile ground for law review notes there. But what else could students be doing, Arnab, on these issues?
Yeah, I think, look, I think get involved on the permitting piece, particularly, like I've been exploring this a little bit. A lot of that law is state. And so there isn't, especially where there's no interstate commerce connection, there isn't a lot that the federal government can do outside of maybe a grant program or something like that. So I think at the state level, if you want more clean energy built in your state, you should be figuring out ways to motivate lawmakers in your state to do so. Also, please check out Employ America's website. We have kind of an open application at all times. So if there's something you're interested in exploring, let us know. I'm sure I'm sure Todd would second that for Roosevelt as well. And then I think I saw another question in there about institutionalizing this a little bit. One thing I would love for folks to explore is something called the Industrial Finance Corporation bill that was introduced by Senator Coons. We worked on that quite a bit, and I think that kind of envisions industrial policy as something done by an institution. I think one of the best ways to kind of describe that might be a Federal Reserve type institution, but for fiscal policy. And it's oriented around supply chain resilience and decarbonization. So if you're interested in exploring different pieces like that, that would be a great thing to take a look at as well.
Awesome. Great note to end this on. This has been a really great discussion. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Arnab, Todd, and Lenore for being our panelists. And thanks to our co-sponsors from around the country. Be sure to stay in touch with the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter. You can sign up for our emails at acslaw.org to find out about more events like this one. We also do fun social stuff too. So make sure you stay in the loop. Follow us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We're at ACS_NY. Thank you all very, very much and have a great rest of your day.